In 1977, the longest occupation of a federal building in American history took place. An occupation you've likely never heard of. This is the story of the 504 sit-in. But the story of the 504 sit-in actually begins 4 years earlier, in 1973, when the Rehabilitation Act was signed into law. Section 504 was an important part of the Rehabilitation Act because it was the first legal document that protected those with disabilities against discrimination. Section 504 stated, "No otherwise qualified individual with a disability shall, solely by reason of her or his disability, be excluded from the participation in, the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance, or under any program or activity conducted by any executive agency or by the United States Postal Service." This was huge for people with disabilities who had faced discrimination and exclusion for their entire lives and had never had any legal protection against it. However, before Section 504 could go into effect, regulations had to be drafted and passed to state how, exactly, Section 504 would impact schools, hospitals, and other establishments that received federal funding. The government realized that enforcing Section 504 was going to be expensive, and so they delayed it for 4 years. By 1977, the disability community had waited long enough, and they demanded that the newly elected President Carter sign the regulations and put Section 504 into action. Instead, Carter assigned Joseph Califano, the new head of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, HUE for short, to create a task force to study Section 504 and its implications. But word soon got out that the regulations were being weakened, so that Section 504 was less like integration and more like separate but equal. The disability community was, rightly, outraged. The American Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities, ACCD for short, demanded that the regulations be signed, unchanged, by April 5, 1977. Otherwise, they would take action. April 5th came, and the regulations weren't signed. So disabled individuals stormed HUE buildings in 10 cities across the country, including Washington, D.C. Most of the protesters were dispersed within a day, but not the ones in San Francisco. On April 5th, 1977, hundreds of protesters, those with disabilities, their families, caregivers, aides, and friends, demonstrated outside the HUE building in San Francisco, and approximately 120 of them walked and rolled through the front doors to set up camp. At first, the federal employees thought it was more or less a joke. They handed out juice and cookies to the protesters as if they were kids on a field trip. But this was no joke, and the protesters meant business. They took up a lot more room than the HUE officials were prepared for due to their many mobility aids. They took over hallways, offices, staircases, and elevators. They even made a makeshift refrigerator for their medications by draping a tarp over an air conditioning unit. The federal employees finally got the idea.
Oh, dang.
The protesters had brought their toothbrushes, and they were ready to stay for as long as it takes. During the duration of the protest, daily rallies happened outside the HUE building to keep spirits up and the media involved. Various speakers came to boost morale while musicians, like Jeff Moyer, played for those gathered.
Civil rights were knocking at our door, but Carter wouldn't stand on 504. Keep your eye on the prize and hold on.
Meanwhile, inside the building, protesters faced opposition both from federal employees and their own bodies. The phone lines were cut a few days into the protest, halting all outgoing calls except for emergency services. At night, federal employees would unplug electric wheelchairs, cutting off their charging time. And each protester faced unique and varied health challenges during the occupation. Many of them dealt with worsening symptoms as time wore on, and some of them would deal with the physical consequences of the occupation for the rest of their lives. But nothing was going to break their resolve. They held daily meetings, collaborating with one another on the best course of action, and even though they faced immense opposition on the inside of the building, they had a great deal of support from those outside. Members of various organizations provided aid in the form of bedding, food, and moral support. Among these organizations were the Glide Memorial Church, the Black Panthers, the Salvation Army, and the Gay Men's Butterfly Brigade. The protesters also had the support of various government officials, including the mayor of San Francisco. During the occupation, a hearing with media coverage was organized in order to educate the American public about what life was like as a disabled individual, without rights. The protesters spoke about low employment rates, housing discrimination, and lack of educational opportunities for disabled individuals. And it was during this hearing that another Hugh official let slip that Califano was considering 22 changes to the 504 regulations, including rules that would make certain hospitals and schools exempt from accessibility requirements, creating separate spaces for disabled individuals, rather than making accommodations for them in all places. It was separate but equal all over again. Finally, 2 weeks into the occupation, 25 individuals were selected by their fellow protesters to travel to Washington, D.C. in order to put more pressure on the politicians. At this time, transportation was wildly inaccessible, so once they were in D.C., those in wheelchairs were literally loaded into the backs of U-Haul trucks to get them from place to place. The protesters met with various congressional representatives. They held candlelight vigils outside Califano's home. They protested outside Jimmy Carter's church. They held a massive rally in Lafayette Park that attracted hundreds of supporters. And finally, on April 28, 1977, after 4 years of waiting and 23 days of hard pressure, Joseph Califano signed the 504 regulations. Unchanged. Section 504 and the regulations that followed gave disabled individuals legal rights they hadn't had before, and it paved the way for greater accessibility and more legal protections against discrimination. But more than that, the 504 sit-in fundamentally changed the way disabled individuals were viewed by the outside world, and the way they viewed themselves. They proved to themselves that they were just as capable of demanding change, and capable of fighting for that change. They showed their resolve and resilience, their creativity and strength in the face of opposition, and their pure grit and determination. Their actions left behind a legacy that continues to empower disabled individuals today, a legacy that has changed America for the better, for everyone.